Okay, here's something interesting to chew on. Think about kidney cancer rates. Where are they highest?
Hmm.
Well, surprisingly, it's often these rural, kind of sparsely populated counties,
Hmm.
often in traditionally Republican states.
Right. Places in the Midwest, the South, the West.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And your first thought might be, okay, must be something about the rural lifestyle, right? Maybe diet, maybe healthcare access, something like that.
Makes sense initially.
But here's the twist. The counties with the lowest kidney cancer rates, they're often very similar places. Also rural, also sparsely populated.
Ah. So that first explanation doesn't really work for both extremes, does it?
Not really. And it gets right to the core of what we're digging into today. Can our intuition, our gut feeling, really lead us astray when we look at data, when we try to predict things?
Yeah, that's a perfect way to frame it. We're looking at this interplay between how we think intuitively and how we should think statistically. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they really clash.
Our brains are pattern finders, right?
Absolutely. Amazing pattern matching machines. We build stories, narratives constantly, super useful most of the time.
But with data.
But when we hit actual data, especially statistics, that intuitive lens, well, it can seriously warp what we're seeing.
Okay.
So today, we're going to unpack some of these ideas. Why patterns that seem really meaningful can just, pop up randomly, and how our minds tend to misread that randomness.
We're drawing on some work, exploring exactly that, right? How our brains process information, the biases that creep in.
Exactly. Some really fascinating research.
And the goal for you listening is, hopefully, to get a clearer picture of why surprising stuff might just be, well, random noise sometimes.
Yeah, not always some deep hidden
And
cause.
maybe help you approach information with a more critical eye, cut through the noise, avoid that feeling of being overwhelmed by data, and maybe have a few aha moments along the way.
Sounds good.
So let's start with randomness itself. How do we get tripped up by it?
Okay, a really key concept here is something called the law of small numbers.
Now that sounds official, like a real law.
Well, funny enough, it's not actually a formal statistical law. It's more a label for a common mental mistake.
Ah,
Imagine a big urn, like a jar, filled with marbles, exactly half red, half white.
okay.
If you just pull out, say, 4 marbles, you could get all red,
Huh.
right? Or all white, or 2 and 2.
Sure, seems possible.
If you did that little 4 marble draw lots and lots of times, mathematically, getting 2 red and 2 white would happen about 6 times more often than getting 4 reds or 4 whites.
Okay, the math works out.
But here's the crucial part. In any single draw of just 4 marbles, if you happen to get all red, there's no special reason for it. There's no cause hiding in that specific handful.
It's just chance for that small group.
Exactly. Small samples are inherently noisy. You're much more likely to see extreme results just by chance in a small group compared to a large one.
Okay, so let's loop that back to the kidney cancer thing.
Right.
Those counties with really high and really low rates, they were sparsely populated, small numbers of people.
That's the key. Sparsely populated means small sample size. In those areas, just a handful more cases or a handful fewer can drastically swing the percentage.
It's like pulling just those 4 marbles. You're way more likely to get an extreme outcome all red or all white than if you pulled out, say, 100 marbles.
Precisely. It's a feature of the math, not necessarily something unique about the water or the politics or the lifestyle in those specific counties causing both the highs and the lows.
But our brains don't like that randomness explanation, do they?
No, we're wired to seek patterns. We want causes. Think about flipping a coin. Which sequence seems more random? HGTTT or HTHTHT?
The second one, HTTTHT, feels more random. The first one looks like a streak.
Most people feel that way, but statistically, in a fair coin toss, both sequences are equally likely. That string of T's feels like it needs an explanation, while the alternating one feels, well, random.
So we impose order even when it's not there.
Yeah, this drive to find causes, to see patterns, was probably super useful evolutionarily. Noticing changes in the environment could keep you alive.
Spotting the predator in the grass.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it misfires when we're dealing with genuinely random statistical stuff.
And that leads to this belief in the law of small numbers.
Right. It's that gut feeling, that wrong intuition, that even a tiny sample should look exactly like the big population it came from.
We see a couple of examples and think, okay, that's how it always is.
We jump to conclusions based on very limited data. And it's not just us. Even researchers can fall for this.
Oh, really?
Yeah, imagine you're testing if, say, 6-year-old girls have bigger vocabularies than 6-year-old boys. Let's assume on average they do.
Okay.
But if you only test a really small group, like maybe 10 kids total, just by random chance, you might happen to pick a few boys who are unusually verbal and a few girls who aren't, and your results might show the boys scoring higher.
Even though the overall trend is the opposite.
Right. That's sampling variation. It's the luck of the draw in who ends up in your sample.
And that makes research kind of a gamble then, especially with small groups.
It absolutely does. You could get results that don't show anything conclusive, or worse, results that are the complete opposite of reality just because of bad sampling luck.
Wow.
And what's really striking is how strong this intuitive bias is, even for experts. Historically, studies have shown that psychologists often use sample sizes so small,
How small?
small enough that they literally had a 50-50 chance of failing to confirm a hypothesis that was actually true.
50%. That's like flipping a coin.
Exactly. Nobody would consciously take those odds. It really shows a deep intuitive misunderstanding of how much results can bounce around just due to random sampling.
Yeah, that's pretty sobering. Okay, so we misinterpret randomness, especially in small samples. Let's switch gears a bit. What about this thing called anchoring?
Ugh, anchoring. Another really powerful one. It's basically how an initial piece of information, often a number, even if it's totally irrelevant, can kind of stick in your mind and pull your later judgments towards it.
Like an anchor weighing down your estimate.
Pretty much. And there are kind of two main ways it works. The first is this idea of adjust and anchor.
Okay.
Think about drawing a line. If I ask you to start near the bottom of a page and draw a line upwards that's exactly 2.5 inches long,
Okay.
your line will probably end up shorter than if I asked you to start near the top and draw downwards, leaving 2.5 inches blank at the bottom.
Huh. Why?
Because you start with that anchor point, the top or bottom edge, and you adjust away from it, but often you don't adjust enough. You stop somewhere within your zone of uncertainty, usually closer to where you started.
I think I see that in real life.
Yeah.
Like when you get off a really fast highway onto a slower road,
Yes, perfect example.
you still feel like you're going too fast, even if you've slowed down, because that highway speed was your anchor.
Yeah.
You didn't adjust down far enough.
Precisely. Or, negotiating a price, or even how loud music seems after you've been listening to it blasting. You turn it down, but your idea of reasonable is still anchored high.
Your mental dial gets stuck partway.
Exactly. And this adjustment process, it takes mental effort. It's more of a system 2 thing, that deliberate thinking.
System 2 being the slower, analytical part of our brain.
Right. And if your mental resources are taxed, maybe you're tired, distracted, under cognitive load, even slightly tipsy, you adjust even less. You stick closer to that anchor.
Okay, that's one type. Adjusting, but not enough. What's the other?
The second type is maybe even sneakier. It's anchoring through priming or suggestion.
Suggestion.
Yeah, like if I ask you, was Gandhi more or less than 144 years old when he died?
Scoffs. Well, obviously less. That's ridiculous.
Of course it's ridiculous. 144 is way off. But just hearing that high number primes your brain. It activates associations related to Gandhi being very old. So when you then try to estimate his actual age of death, that initial crazy anchor still pulls your estimate higher than it might have been otherwise.
Wow. Even a completely nonsensical number has an effect.
It can, yeah.
Yeah.
It taps into this tendency of our minds, often called WI Saida, what you see is all there is.
W.Y. Sayeti.
Yeah. Basically, our system 1, the fast intuitive part, it just works with whatever information is immediately present. It tries to make sense of the statement Gandhi 144 by activating related thoughts, even if the statement itself is false. The anchor influences the associative network regardless of its credibility.
So our judgment gets shaped just by what's put in front of us, even if we know it's not right.
Pretty much. And the real-world impact is huge. There was this great experiment with real estate agents.
Oh, yeah. What did they do?
They gave these agents the standard packet of info about a house they were supposed to appraise. But they secretly manipulated one thing, the asking price listed in the packet. Sometimes it was much higher than the real listing price, sometimes much lower.
And did it affect the agent's appraisals? They're professionals. They should know better.
You'd think. They absolutely insisted the asking price didn't influence their judgment at all, but the data showed a massive anchoring effect, about 41%.
41%. That's huge.
It was huge. They were pulled towards that manipulated asking price almost as much as business students who had zero real estate experience.
And they didn't even realize it.
That's the kicker. The pros denied being influenced, whereas the students were actually more likely to admit the asking price might have swayed them.
Incredible. So this has massive implications for any kind of negotiation then.
Absolutely. Selling a house, negotiating a salary, Making that first offer is incredibly powerful. It sets the anchor.
So you should always try to make the first offer.
Generally gives you an advantage, yes. And if
Wow.
someone hits you with a totally outrageous first offer, say way too low if you're selling.
Yeah. What do? Make an equally outrageous, high counteroffer.
Yeah. The advice is actually not to do that. That just creates this huge gap that's hard to bridge. Instead, you should make it really clear that you're not even going to continue the discussion with that number on the table. You need to break the anchor's power.
It's interesting. Just refuse to play ball with that anchor.
Right. And think about policy, too, like setting caps on damages awarded in personal injury lawsuits.
Okay.
You might think that helps defendants by limiting the maximum payout, but it could unintentionally increase the size of smaller awards because that cap now acts as a high anchor that influences judges and juries, pulling potentially lower awards upward.
Oh, unintended consequences.
Definitely. The big takeaway with anchoring is just assume any number you see on the table is having some effect on your thinking. And if the stakes are high, you really need to actively fight against that pull. Engage System 2.
Okay, that's anchoring. Really pervasive. Let's move on to another one of these mental shortcuts or heuristics. Availability. What's that about?
The availability heuristic is pretty straightforward on the surface. We judge how frequent or probable something is based on how easily examples come to mind.
If it's easy to remember, we think it's common.
Exactly. If instances just pop into your head effortlessly, you tend to overestimate how often that thing happens.
It's intuitive sense. Vivid stuff, recent stuff, probably comes to mind easier.
Right. But that ease of recall, the fluency of retrieval, isn't always a good guide to actual frequency.
How so?
There's a classic study. People were asked to list either 6 examples of times they acted assertively or 12 examples.
Okay, 6 versus 12.
Now, who do you think rated themselves as more assertive afterwards?
Maybe the ones who listed 12, because they actually recalled more instances.
That's what you might think intuitively, but it was the opposite. The people asked to list only 6 rated themselves as more assertive.
Wait, why?
Because listing 6 examples is pretty easy for most people. High fluency. But listing 12, that gets tough. You start struggling to think of more examples. Low fluency.
So it wasn't the number of examples they listed, but the feeling of ease or difficulty while listing them.
Exactly. The subjective experience of retrieval fluency trumped the actual number of instances retrieved. The difficulty of coming up with 12 examples made them feel less assertive overall.
That's fascinating. It's about the feeling, not just the content.
It really is, and other things can affect that feeling. Another study had people list assertive behaviors while either smiling or frowning.
Smiling or frowning, how does it matter?
Well, frowning is often associated with cognitive strain, with difficulty. And sure enough, the frowners reported finding it harder to recall assertive examples, and they rated themselves as less assertive than the smilers did.
Wow. So even your facial expression can influence this availability effect.
It seems so. It all ties into how our intuitive System 1 sets expectations. It expects retrieval to be easy for common things. When retrieval feels unexpectedly hard, System 1 gets surprised, and that feeling of surprise or difficulty influences the judgment.
Unless System 2 steps in.
Right. Our analytical System 2 can override or reinterpret that feeling. If you were told beforehand that, say, background music might make recalling examples harder,
then the difficulty wouldn't be a surprise.
Exactly. You'd attribute the difficulty to the music, not to your lack of assertiveness. System 2 can adjust the expectations set by System 1.
So if we're more engaged, more thoughtful, less just going with the flow, we're less likely to be swayed just by how easily something comes to mind.
That's the idea. And research supports this. When people are personally invested in the judgment, they tend to rely more on the content they retrieve, not just the ease of retrieval.
Like if it really matters to them.
Yeah. For instance, students with a family history of heart disease were asked to list risky behaviors. When they found it hard to list many risky behaviors, they actually felt more at risk, unlike the usual availability effect. They were digging deeper, using System 2 because it was personally relevant.
So the takeaway is, when we're relying on System 1, just coasting mentally, we're very vulnerable to this availability bias, judging things based on how easily they pop into our head.
Precisely.
Okay, so how does this availability idea connect to how we perceive risks? That seems like a big area where this could cause problems.
Absolutely. This is where we see things like availability cascades.
Cascades!
Yeah. Think about plane crashes. They're incredibly dramatic. They get tons of media coverage, right?
Definitely. Very vivid.
So examples of plane crashes are highly available in our minds. This can lead us to overestimate the actual risk of flying compared to, say, the risk from driving, or even less dramatic risks like indoor air pollution, which might statistically be a much bigger threat but gets way less attention.
So the vividness and media coverage make it easy to recall, which makes us think it's more common or riskier than it is.
Exactly. It cascades through public discourse, people talk about it, the media reports on the talk, politicians feel pressure to respond.
I see that after natural disasters too.
Yeah.
Like a big earthquake hits, and suddenly everyone rushes out to buy earthquake insurance and supplies.
Yep. Demand spikes. People take protective action. But then
Then the memory fades.
the memory fades, the feeling of urgency fades, and people become complacent again until the next event. It's hard to stay vigilant based on statistics alone. We react more strongly to available, experienced events. We tend to prepare for the last disaster, not necessarily the worst possible one.
And this ties into our emotions too, right? What Paul Slovic called the affect heuristic.
Yes, very much so. The affect heuristic is basically a shortcut where we consult our feelings to make a judgment. Instead of asking, what do I think about this? We ask, how do I feel about it?
Our gut reaction.
Our gut reaction. If something feels good, we judge it as having high benefits and low risks. If something feels bad or scary, we judge it as low benefit and high risk.
Even if the risks and benefits aren't actually related like that.
Right. Slovic did studies showing that if you told people about the high benefits of a technology, like nuclear power, they would then rate its risks as lower, even if you gave them no new risk information, and vice versa.
Wow. So the emotional tag overrides the rational assessment.
The emotional tail wags the rational dog, as Jonathan Haidt put it. It simplifies the world, things are either good or bad. But it makes it hard to grapple with complex trade-offs, where something might have both significant benefits and significant risks.
And Slovic argues that risk itself isn't purely objective.
His point is that risk is always a human construct. What we choose to measure, how we measure it, who gets to define it, these things shape our perception of risk. It's not just a number floating out there in the world.
Okay, so availability cascades, driven by vivid events and fueled by our emotional reactions, can really distort how we see risk. You mentioned Love Canal and the Alar scare.
Those are classic examples where intense media focus and public fear and availability cascade led to significant reactions, policy changes, economic impacts, even though later analysis suggested the initial risk perception might have been exaggerated.
And unfortunately, people can exploit this.
Right, definitely. Terrorists, for example, rely heavily on creating availability cascades. Events like 9/11 caused relatively few casualties compared to, say, annual traffic deaths, but the sheer horror and memorability create immense fear and dominate public consciousness and policy for years. They achieve psychological impact far beyond the physical damage.
So how do we manage these cascades in society? Is it about trusting experts more or listening to public fears?
That's a huge debate. Some, like Cass Sunstein, argue for insulating policy decisions more from these public emotional waves, relying on expert cost-benefit analysis. Others, like Slovic, argue that public emotions contain valid signals about values and that simply dismissing them is undemocratic and potentially unwise. There's no easy answer.
A really tricky balance. Okay, let's shift to another major heuristic. Representativeness. What's the core idea here?
Representativeness is when we judge the probability of something based on how much it resembles or is representative of a particular stereotype or prototype in our mind.
Judging by similarity.
Exactly. Remember Tom W., the description. Shy, likes neat systems, little feel for people.
Right. Sounds like a stereotypical engineer or computer science student.
Precisely. So if you're asked whether Tom W. is more likely studying computer science or, say, social work, you intuitively lean towards computer science because the description represents your stereotype of a CS student. You're judging based on how well he fits the category.
Even though there might be way more social work students overall.
That's the potential pitfall. Representativeness makes us focus on the similarity and often ignore the underlying base rates, how common each category actually is.
Okay. So what are the main ways this trips us up? You mentioned the sins of representativeness.
Right. One big sin is being too willing to predict rare events just because the description seems to fit.
Like the person reading the New York Times on the subway.
Yeah. You see that, and your stereotype says highly educated, maybe even PhD. So you might think they're more likely to have a PhD than to not have a college degree at all.
That's statistically.
Statistically, there are vastly more people on the subway without college degrees than people with PhDs. The base rate for PhDs is tiny. Reading the Times might be representative of a PhD holder, but you're ignoring the low probability of encountering one in the first place.
We get dazzled by the stereotype match and forget the odds.
Exactly. Another sin is ignoring the base rate information even when it's given to you, especially once you have a personality sketch.
Like with Tom W. If we knew the percentage of students in each major.
Right. Even if you're told computer science is a very small major, low base rate, the description of Tom W. is so compellingly representative of that stereotype that people tend to ignore the base rate and still predict he's in CS.
The story overrides the stats.
Pretty much. And a related sin is being insensitive to the quality of the evidence. That description of Tom W., maybe it came from an unreliable source, maybe it was based on a single awkward interaction years ago.
Doesn't matter.
Often it doesn't seem to matter much. The description itself activates the stereotype in System 1, and we run with it, regardless of whether we should trust the description in the first place. WYSAOD again.
But activating System 2 helps here, too. You mentioned the frowning experiment.
Yeah, inducing cognitive strain, like by having people frown, seemed to make them engage System 2 more, and they became more sensitive to the base rates and the Tom W problem. They were less swayed by just the representative description.
So representativeness makes us focus on stereotypes, ignore base rates, and trust descriptions maybe more than we should. How do we fight that? You mentioned Bayesian thinking. Sounds complex.
It can be, but the basic idea is actually quite simple and powerful. It's about formally combining what you already know, the base rates, with the new evidence you get. So, you start with your prior belief, the base rate probability. How likely is something before you get the specific evidence? Then you assess the evidence itself. How much more likely is this evidence if the thing is true versus if it's false?
How diagnostic the evidence is.
Exactly. And Bayesian reasoning gives you a mathematical way to update your initial probability based on that diagnosticity.
Can you give a quick example with Tom W?
Sir, let's say the base rate for computer science majors is really low, maybe only 3%.
Okay.
But let's also say that description of Tom W. is maybe 4 times more likely to fit a computer science student than a student in any other field.
So the description is quite diagnostic, even if the base rate is low.
Right. A Bayesian calculation would combine these. You don't just jump to thinking he's definitely in CS, but you also don't ignore the description. The updated probability, doing the math, would end up around 11%.
So higher than the 3% base rate, but nowhere near certain. It balances the prior odds with the new evidence.
That's the core idea. Anchor on the base rate, then adjust based on how strong the specific evidence truly is.
Makes sense. Now, there's another related error you mentioned.
Yeah.
The conjunction fallacy. That sounds like a logic puzzle.
It kind of is. It's when we judge a combination of things, a conjunction, as being more probable than just one of those things on its own.
How can a combination be more probable than one of its parts?
Logically, it can't. That's the fallacy. The classic example is the Linda problem.
Okay, Linda. What's her story?
You get a description. Linda is 31, single, outspoken, very bright, majored in philosophy, concerned with discrimination and social justice, participated in anti-nuclear protests.
Okay, paints a picture.
Then you're asked, which is more probable? A, Linda is a bank teller, or B, Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement.
Ah, okay. Intuitively, option B feels much more likely, right? The description fits feminist activists way better than just bank teller.
Exactly. That's the representativeness heuristic at work again. Option B creates a more coherent, representative story based on the description.
But logically.
Logically, option B must be less probable than option A. Why? Because the group of feminist bank tellers is entirely contained within the larger group of bank tellers. To be in group B, you have to also be in group A. Adding a condition can only make something less probable or equally probable at best, never more.
Right. Set theory 101.
But studies show that 85–90% of undergraduate students choose option B. They violate a fundamental rule of probability because the representativeness, the plausibility of the story is so strong.
Wow. Does this happen all the time, or only when the combination makes a better story?
It mainly happens when the added detail makes the conjunction seem more representative or plausible. If I ask, is Mark more likely to have hair or to have blonde hair? You'll correctly say have hair.
Because blonde hair doesn't make the description fit better.
Right. Or Jane is a teacher versus Jane is a teacher who walks to work. The walking detail doesn't increase the plausibility based on a stereotype of teachers. The fallacy occurs when representativeness pulls against logic.
It's that less is more thing again, where the more specific representative description feels more likely, even though it's statistically less so.
Exactly. System 1 averages or looks for coherence. It doesn't follow strict probability rules. Though sometimes, if you evaluate the options side by side explicitly, System 2 might catch the error unless the pull of the plausible story is just too strong, like with Linda.
You also had that tennis example, right? Borg winning the first set but losing the match versus just Borg losing the first set.
Yeah, same idea. Losing the first set is a broader category, so it has to be more probable. But winning the first set and losing the match might feel more plausible for a great player like Borg, leading people to incorrectly judge it as more likely.
And it even works without words. The colored die experiment.
Right. A die with more green faces than red. People bet more on a specific sequence like GRGRR, which seemed representative of the die having mostly green faces, than on a shorter sequence, RGRR, even though the second sequence is logically contained within the first and therefore must be more probable. Representativeness dominated logic, even in a purely visual task.
But framing it differently helps. Asking how many out of 100 people instead of probabilities.
Yes, that often reduces the fallacies significantly. Thinking in terms of frequencies, imagining concrete instances, seems to help engage our more logical spatial reasoning. It makes the subset relationship clearer.
So the conjunction fallacy really highlights how easily our intuition, our System 1's love for coherent stories, can steamroll basic logic, even when System 2 should know better.
It really does. System 2 isn't always paying attention.
Okay, shifting slightly again, you talked about causal versus statistical base rates. What's the difference there?
This is a really interesting point about which base rates we actually pay attention to. Imagine a cab accident scenario. Version 1. You're told 85% of the cabs in the city are green, 15% are blue. A witness identifies the cab in an accident as blue. You're also told how reliable the witness is.
Okay, standard base rate info.
Version 2. You're told green cabs are involved in 85% of all accidents, blue cabs in 15%. Same witness information.
Mathematically, isn't that the same underlying probability information?
Yes, the numbers work out the same way for calculating the probability the cab was blue, but psychologically, people treat them very differently.
Oh, so
People pay much more attention to the base rate in version 2, where it says green cabs are involved in 85% of accidents.
why?
Because that version provides a causal base rate. It implies a reason. Maybe green cab drivers are more reckless, maybe their cars are less well-maintained. It gives a story, a potential cause for the statistic.
Whereas 85% of cabs are green is just a plain statistical fact, no story attached.
Exactly. Causal base rates, things that sound like they explain why the numbers are the way they are, get woven into our thinking much more readily than purely statistical base rates. We integrate them into our narrative.
Even if that causal story is basically a stereotype, like green cab drivers are reckless.
Well, yeah, that's the tricky part. We're often told, rightly, to avoid stereotyping, but when a base rate has causal implications, it feels less like stereotyping and more like using relevant information about how the world works, even if the line is blurry.
So we're more influenced by stats that seem to explain things.
Definitely. In another study, students were told about how difficult a Yale exam was, how many students typically failed. This causal base rate strongly influenced their predictions about whether specific individual students would pass or fail.
Because the difficulty explains the likely outcome.
Right. But contrast that with a study about helping behavior. Students learned the statistical base rate that surprisingly few people actually help someone in distress when others are around, the bystander effect.
Okay, a statistical fact.
But when they were then shown videos of individual people and asked to predict if that person would help, they largely ignored the base rate they just learned.
They didn't apply the statistic to the individual.
Not really. It showed that surprising statistical facts often don't stick or get applied easily, but give people one vivid story, one surprising individual case.
And they generalize from that.
And they generalize readily from that. We learn better from stories and causal links than from abstract statistics.
It keeps coming back to that preference for narrative and causes over plain numbers.
It really does. Which leads us perfectly into the final big concept we need to tackle, regression to the mean.
Okay, regression to the mean. I've heard this phrase, but it always feels a bit slippery. Can you make it concrete?
Let's try.
Okay.
The classic example is the flight instructor.
Okay.
This instructor notices something. When he praises a student pilot effusively for a really exceptionally smooth landing,
Yeah.
the student's next landing is usually not as good. It's worse. But when he yells at a student for a really terrible, bumpy landing, their next landing is usually better.
Okay. So the instructor concludes.
He concludes that praise must make pilots complacent and perform worse, while criticism motivates them and makes them perform better. Seems logical based on his observations, right?
Yeah, sounds like direct cause and effect.
But it's very likely not. What he's probably observing is just regression to the mean.
How so?
Think about that exceptionally good landing. Was it all skill? Probably not entirely. There was likely some element of luck involved too, a favorable gust of wind, perfect timing, whatever.
Okay, so skill plus some good luck.
Right. So on the next attempt, the skill level is probably about the same, but that extra bit of good luck is unlikely to repeat. The performance naturally regresses back towards the pilot's average level.
Ah, and the terrible landing.
Same logic, opposite direction.
Yeah.
A really awful landing was probably skill minus some bad luck, an unexpected crosswind, a moment of distraction. On the next try, the skill is similar, but the bad luck is less likely to strike again. So the performance improves, regressing back towards their average.
So the praise and criticism might have had nothing to do with the change in performance. It was just the natural ebb and flow around their average skill level.
Very likely. Extreme performances, good or bad, are often driven partly by chance, and chance effects tend not to persist. Things tend to drift back towards the average. That's regression to the mean.
So whenever there's an element of luck or randomness involved.
You'll see regression to the mean. If performance was perfectly determined by skill alone, with no luck, then a great performance would likely be followed by another great performance. But most things in life aren't like that.
Sports performance, test scores, business results.
All involve a mix of skill and luck. So the player who has an unbelievably hot first half is statistically likely to cool down in the second half, not necessarily because they're choking, but because that extreme performance was partly luck, and luck tends to even out. They regress to their mean.
We're so quick to invent causal stories, though. He felt the pressure, she got complacent.
We are. We find simple statistical regularity hard to accept. We crave causes. Sir Francis Galton, who discovered this phenomenon,
Studying height, right?
yes, studying the heights of parents and children in the late 1800s. He found tall parents tended to have children who were also tall, but usually a bit closer to the average height than the parents were. And short parents had children shorter than average, but typically not as short as they were.
A regression towards mediocrity, he called it.
Initially, yes. It took him a while to realize it wasn't some biological force pulling everyone to the average, but just a statistical consequence of the fact the correlation between parent height and child height isn't perfect.
Correlation. Okay, so it's about how closely two things are related.
Exactly. The correlation coefficient measures the strength of the relationship. If it's a perfect +1 or -1, like measuring height in feet versus inches, there's no regression. But for almost everything else, SAT scores and college GPA, income and education, spouses' intelligence scores, the correlation is less than perfect.
And the weaker the correlation.
The more regression you'll see. If the correlation is 0, the best prediction for the second measure is just its overall average, regardless of the first measure.
Okay, so back to that example. Highly intelligent women tending to marry men less intelligent than themselves. That's just regression.
If we assume intelligence is imperfectly correlated between spouses, which seems likely, and that average intelligence is roughly the same for men and women, then yes, it's a statistical inevitability.
How?
Highly intelligent women are, by definition, at the extreme upper end of the intelligence distribution. Because the correlation with their partner's intelligence isn't perfect, their partners are statistically more likely to be closer to the average intelligence level than they are. It doesn't mean they marry unintelligent men, just men likely less exceptionally intelligent than they are themselves. Regression pulls extreme scores towards the mean.
Wow. That explains a lot of apparent patterns without needing complex social theories. Like why depressed kids might seem to get better after drinking energy drinks.
Right. If you select a group specifically because they are highly depressed, an extreme score,
Yeah.
they are statistically likely to be less depressed, closer to the average, when you measure them again later, regardless of whether the energy drink or any other intervention actually did anything. That's why you absolutely need control groups in treatment studies to separate real effects from mere regression.
This is huge. Regression is everywhere, and we constantly mistake it for cause and effect. How does this mess up our predictions?
Our intuitive predictions are often completely non-regressive. We fail to account for it.
Like with Julie, the fluent 4-year-old reader.
Exactly. We see that exceptional early reading ability. System 1 finds a simple causal story, great reader, smart kid, high college GPA. It evaluates her reading, maybe 95th percentile for her age, and then just substitutes that evaluation for the prediction, predicts a 95th percentile college GPA.
Matching the intensity.
Matching the intensity, yes. It completely ignores the fact that the correlation between reading age at 4 and college GPA is far from perfect. There will be regression. Her GPA is likely to be good, but probably closer to the average than her initial reading percentile would suggest.
We predict based on the strength of the current evidence without considering the statistical pull towards the average.
Right. That experiment you mentioned, where people rated descriptions of freshmen for impressiveness and then predicted their GPA, they gave basically the same percentile score for both. Prediction simply matched evaluation. Zero regression accounted for.
So how should we make predictions to account for this?
There's a more systematic approach. First, you need a baseline prediction. What's the average outcome? What's the base rate? What would you guess if you knew nothing specific about this case?
Okay, start with the average.
Second, make your intuitive prediction based on the specific evidence you have. Like, how impressive does Julie seem? Third, and this is key, your final prediction should be somewhere between the baseline and your intuition. How far you move from the baseline depends on how strong and reliable your evidence actually is.
So if the evidence is weak or the correlation is low, you stick closer to the average.
Exactly. If you have literally no useful evidence, your best bet is the baseline average. Only if you have extremely strong, highly predictive evidence should your prediction stay close to your initial extreme intuition.
But are there times when making these more moderate regressive predictions isn't the right call?
Well, you could argue that in some situations, the cost of different types of errors isn't symmetrical. A venture capitalist might prefer to make overly optimistic predictions because the payoff from one huge success outweighs many small failures. A conservative banker might prefer overly pessimistic predictions to avoid any chance of a catastrophic loss.
So the context matters.
The context and the consequences of being wrong matter. But for making the most accurate prediction possible, unbiased and accounting for regression is the way to go. If you choose to make extreme predictions based on moderate evidence, you should at least be aware you're doing it and why.
This really seems to tie everything together, viewing it through the lens of System 1 and System 2.
It does. Making those extreme non-regressive predictions, predicting rare events from weak evidence that's very characteristic of System 1. It loves coherence. It substitutes easy questions for hard ones. It generates confidence from the story it builds, not necessarily the quality of the data.
WISID strikes again.
Absolutely. And regression itself. It's just hard for System 2 to grasp intuitively as well. It requires statistical training and deliberate effort. Even when we identify regression, like the flight instructor might have if prompted, our first instinct is still to slap a causal interpretation onto it.
So overcoming these biases really requires engaging that slower, more effortful System 2 to challenge our gut feelings and look critically at the statistics.
That's the challenge, yes. Constant vigilance.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up. If you had to boil down the most crucial takeaways from this whole deep dive into intuition versus statistics, what would they be?
I'd say, first, be deeply aware that your intuition can seriously mislead you with data, even when it feels right. Second, always consider randomness and sample size. Small samples breed extremes. Third, watch out for anchors and the subtle influence of availability. What pops into your head easily isn't always what's most frequent or probable.
Okay.
Fourth, recognize when you're using representativeness, judging by stereotypes, and consciously check the base rates and the logic, like avoiding the conjunction fallacy. And finally, internalize the idea of regression to the mean. Expect extreme outcomes to be followed by more average ones, and don't automatically invent causal stories for it.
That's a great summary. So for everyone listening, how can they actually apply this in their daily lives? What's the practical takeaway?
It really starts with awareness. Just pausing before you jump to a conclusion based on a statistic, a news story, or even a personal observation. Ask yourself those critical questions. Is this a small sample? Could it just be random chance? Am I being anchored by some initial number? Is this just easily available in my memory, or is it truly frequent? Am I relying on a stereotype? And what are the actual odds? Is this extreme performance likely to regress?
So activating System 2 deliberately.
Exactly. Just asking those questions forces you to slow down and think more critically, which is the first step towards making more rational judgments and decisions.
Fantastic advice. And maybe a final thought to leave everyone with.
How about this? Now that you're more aware of these cognitive quirks, these ways our minds take shortcuts, how will you approach that next surprising statistic or that pattern that seems just so obvious? And maybe reflect on this. Is our reliance on intuition mostly a necessary, helpful shortcut for navigating a complex world? Or is it fundamentally a dangerous flaw we constantly need to fight against?
Definitely something to ponder. Thanks for breaking all that down.
My pleasure. It's fascinating stuff.